When Eleanor Hartwell's husband Marcus died unexpectedly at 52, leaving behind a $340 million private equity empire, his mother Patricia looked her daughter-in-law dead in the eye in the middle of his mahogany-paneled office and said, with a smile sharp enough to cut glass, "That money is mine, sweetheart." It always was. What Patricia didn't know, what she could never have imagined in her most arrogant, scheming moment, was that Marcus had spent the last 3 years of his life quietly, methodically, and brilliantly building an airtight legal fortress around every single asset, every account, every holding, and every trust. He had put Eleanor's name on all of it, and he had left behind a sealed brown legal envelope, stamped with the words ownership records, sitting in the bottom drawer of his desk, waiting for exactly this moment. In front of lawyers, bankers, family members, and a room full of witnesses who had gathered expecting to watch Eleanor crumble, she opened that envelope instead, and watched Patricia lose absolutely everything she had tried to steal. If your mother-in-law tried to rob you blind the same week you buried your husband, would you walk away quietly, or would you make sure she never forgot the day she underestimated you? Drop your answer in the comments right now. And before we go any further into this story, hit that like button and subscribe, because this one is going to leave you speechless. Eleanor Hartwell was not born into money. That is the first thing you need to understand about her, because it is the thing Patricia Hartwell never respected and never forgave. Eleanor grew up in a modest 2-story house in Columbus, Ohio, the daughter of a high school history teacher and a registered nurse who worked double shifts every weekend so that Eleanor and her younger brother could attend a decent school. There were no trust funds, no summer homes in the Hamptons, no family lawyers on retainer. There was a kitchen table where Eleanor did her homework under a flickering fluorescent light, a mother who smelled like antiseptic and unconditional love, and a father who told her every single night that the most powerful thing she could ever own was the contents of her own mind. Eleanor listened. She earned a full academic scholarship to Ohio State, graduated summa cum laude with a degree in finance, and then clawed her way into a prestigious MBA program at Columbia University in New York City. She took out loans. She worked part-time at a midtown accounting firm. She ate ramen in a studio apartment on 112th Street while her classmates ordered bottle service at rooftop bars. And she did not complain once, because she understood something that most people her age had not yet grasped, that the foundation you build in silence is the one that holds when everything else shakes. She met Marcus Hartwell in her second year at Columbia. He was a guest lecturer, 40 years old at the time, already the founder of Hartwell Capital Partners, a private equity firm that managed portfolios for some of the wealthiest institutional investors on the East Coast. He was tall, quiet, and devastatingly intelligent, with silver threading through his dark hair and the kind of measured, unhurried confidence that only comes from a man who has nothing left to prove. He noticed Eleanor not because she was the most beautiful woman in the room, though she was striking with her sharp cheekbones and steady dark eyes, but because she was the only student who challenged his core thesis during the Q&A session without flinching when he pushed back. They argued for 11 minutes in front of the entire lecture hall. He asked her to coffee the next morning. They dated for 2 years before Marcus proposed. Eleanor knew from the very beginning that Patricia Hartwell was a problem. Marcus's father, Robert, had passed away years earlier, leaving Patricia as the singular matriarch of the Hartwell family, a woman who had spent 4 decades defining her entire identity through her son's success. Patricia lived in a 14-room colonial estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, decorated with oil paintings she had not chosen herself and furniture she could not identify by designer but referenced constantly by price. She wore St. John suits to lunch and Chanel to dinner, and she spoke about money the way other women spoke about God, with reverence, with possessiveness, and with the unspoken belief that only certain people deserved proximity to it. Eleanor was not one of those people. Patricia made that clear from the very first Sunday dinner. She looked at Eleanor's simple silk blouse and J.Crew trousers, looked away, and began speaking to Marcus about the daughter of one of his father's old business partners, a girl named Cassandra who had attended Spence and Vassar and whose family had a compound in Martha's Vineyard. Patricia mentioned Cassandra casually the way you mention the weather, but the message underneath was a sledgehammer. Eleanor sat at that dinner table, cut her lamb chop into precise pieces, and smiled with the patience of a woman who understood that this was a long game, not a short one. The microaggressions were endless and deliberate. When Eleanor suggested a catering company for Marcus and Eleanor's engagement party, Patricia had already hired her own, without telling anyone, and presented it as a fait accompli with a smile that dared Eleanor to object. When Eleanor framed 3 of her academic achievement awards to hang in the study of the brownstone she and Marcus had purchased together on the Upper East Side, Patricia visited the following week, looked at the frames and said, "How sweet." Marcus always did have a soft spot for ambition in other people. When Eleanor became pregnant with their son James 18 months into the marriage, Patricia arrived at the hospital before Eleanor had even finished delivering and spent the first hour telling the nursing staff that she had already selected the child's pediatrician, a man who had treated Marcus himself and whose practice was, according to Patricia, appropriate for a Hartwell. Marcus saw it. He was not a blind man. He would take Eleanor's hand on the drive home from Greenwich and squeeze it without speaking, and Eleanor would look out the passenger window at the Connecticut darkness and breathe slowly and think about her mother working double shifts and her father grading papers under a lamp, and she would remind herself that she had not come this far to be diminished by a woman in a St. John's suit. What Eleanor did not fully understand during those early years was the depth of Patricia's financial obsession. It went beyond snobbery. Patricia had grown up the daughter of a modestly wealthy Boston family that had lost most of its money in a series of bad investments during her adolescence, and the humiliation of that collapse had carved something permanent and ugly into her psychology. She had married Robert Hartwell in her early 20s with a specific and calculated intent to secure herself against ever feeling that particular humiliation again. When Robert died and left the bulk of his estate to Marcus through a trust that Robert had structured himself, Patricia received a generous but defined inheritance and nothing more. She had expected more. She had expected control. And she had never fully processed the fact that she did not get it. When Marcus met Eleanor and it became clear that this woman, this Ohio schoolteacher's daughter with her Columbia MBA and her quiet competence, was going to become the primary figure in Marcus's life, Patricia's obsession calcified into something colder and more strategic. She began, very quietly, to insert herself into Marcus's financial world. She would call his office under the pretense of social scheduling and extract information from his assistant about upcoming meetings or portfolio restructures. She cultivated a relationship with one of the junior partners at Hartwell Capital, a man named Gregory Oakes who was hungry for advancement and susceptible to flattery, and she fed him attention and access to her Greenwich social network in exchange for whispered details about the firm's internal operations. She maintained a duplicate set of holiday gift records and personal correspondence files that she had begun keeping from the moment Robert died, documenting every significant financial gesture Marcus made so that she could construct, if she ever needed to, a narrative in which she was the silent architect of his success. None of this was illegal precisely, but all of it was predatory. And Marcus, who loved his mother in the complicated and forgiving way that sons love difficult mothers, was only partially aware of the extent of it. What Marcus was aware of, because he was one of the most sophisticated financial minds in the private equity sector and because he had been watching Patricia for 40 years, was the probability of what would happen if he died before Eleanor. He did not share this concern with Eleanor directly, not because he did not trust her, but because he did not want her to spend their marriage in a state of dread. Instead, he did what he always did with complex problems. He solved it quietly, completely, and in advance. 3 years before his death, Marcus began meeting privately with a team that included his estate attorney, a forensic accountant, and a private trust law specialist. He restructured Hartwell Capital Partners so that his 68% controlling stake was held inside a layered trust vehicle with Eleanor named as the sole primary beneficiary and trustee successor. He transferred the deed to the Greenwich brownstone, the Hamptons estate in Bridgehampton, and the ski property in Aspen directly into Eleanor's name. He established a separate holding company, registered in Delaware, that owned the family's art collection, vehicle fleet, and liquidity reserves, with Eleanor as the sole managing member. He documented every single one of these transactions with obsessive precision, including signed disclosures, notarized transfer certificates, and a 12-page letter written entirely in his own handwriting, addressed to Eleanor, explaining what he had done and why, and telling her exactly where to find the sealed brown envelope in the bottom left drawer of his office desk if she ever needed it. He did not tell Eleanor the envelope existed. He sealed it, labeled it, and placed it there. Then he went on living, going to work, coaching James's Little League games on Saturdays, taking Eleanor to Nobu on their anniversary, and being, by all visible measures, A man who intended to live for a very long time. He did not live for a very long time. A massive cardiac event took Marcus Hartwell at 52 years old on a Tuesday morning in March, in the lobby of his firm's Park Avenue office, before anyone around him understood what was happening. By the time the paramedics arrived, it was already over. Eleanor received the call at 8:47 in the morning, while she was in the kitchen of their Upper East Side brownstone, packing James's lunch for school. She stood at the kitchen counter with the phone pressed against her ear, and she did not make a sound for 11 seconds. Then she told the voice on the phone that she understood, set the phone down on the marble countertop, and sat down very carefully on the kitchen floor, and held her 8-year-old son, who had just walked in asking why mommy was on the floor, and she held him and breathed and told herself that whatever came next, she would not fall apart. Not completely. Not where it mattered. Patricia arrived at the brownstone within 2 hours of the call. Eleanor had barely changed out of her clothes. The housekeeper had let Patricia in, and Eleanor came downstairs to find her mother-in-law already seated in the living room, dressed in a black Armani suit as though she had dressed for the occasion, her white hair immaculate, her posture rigid with what looked from a distance like grief but felt, up close, like anticipation. "You'll need to call the estate attorney first thing tomorrow," Patricia said, before she said anything about Marcus, before she asked about James, before she offered so much as a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "I know Robert's original intentions for the firm. There are things that need to be addressed." Eleanor looked at her mother-in-law for a long moment, absorbing the sentence the way you absorb a slap, not with surprise, but with a quiet, complete cataloging of what it means and what it reveals. She said nothing. She offered Patricia tea. Patricia declined and began talking about the firm's board structure, and Eleanor went to the kitchen, stood at the counter, closed her eyes for exactly 4 seconds, and then opened them again and began the rest of her life. The week after Marcus's funeral was, by any reasonable measure, the most grueling week of Eleanor's adult life. The service was held at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue, which was filled to absolute capacity with a cross-section of New York's financial elite, several members of the city's political establishment, and the kind of quietly powerful attendees who arrive without press and leave without comment. Eleanor stood at the front of the church in a custom midnight navy across coat dress and did not cry during the service, not because she was not devastated, but because she had made a deliberate decision the morning of the funeral that the first time she allowed herself to fully grieve Marcus, it would be in private, in the dark, without an audience. She owed herself that much. Patricia sat in the front pew wearing a black veil and accepting condolences as though she were the primary mourner, gently steering well-wishers into sidebar conversations about Marcus's legacy and what it would mean for the firm going forward, threading into those conversations, with the practiced subtlety of a woman who had been playing this game for decades, the suggestion that she would of course be closely involved in guiding the transition. The following Monday, 3 days after the funeral, Eleanor went to Marcus's office for the first time. She had asked the firm's operations manager to keep the office sealed until she was ready, and they had honored that request with the discretion that Marcus's team had always shown. She drove herself there in the black Range Rover, took the elevator to the 22nd floor, and walked into the corner office with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Park Avenue and sat in Marcus's chair for 4 full minutes without moving, just breathing in the smell of him, cedar and black pepper and the specific cool dryness of expensive paper. And then she stood up, took off her coat, and began going through the room with methodical, quiet focus. Patricia arrived unannounced 40 minutes later. Eleanor heard her heels on the marble hallway floor before the door opened. Patricia walked in, took in the scene. Eleanor at the desk, papers spread before her, files pulled from the credenza, and something moved behind her eyes. A quickening. A recalibration. "I didn't expect you here so soon," Patricia said. "I own the building," Eleanor said without looking up. Patricia moved toward the desk slowly, surveying the office with the proprietary ease of a woman who had decided something. She picked up a crystal paperweight from the corner of the desk, a heavy piece, a gift Marcus had received from a London counterpart, and turned it over in her hands. Then she set it down and looked at Eleanor with a smile that was technically a smile the way a scalpel is technically a blade. "Eleanor," she said, with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow, "I want you to understand something before the lawyers get involved. This firm, these assets, this money, Marcus built all of it on the foundation his father laid. On the foundation I protected for 30 years. Whatever documents you think you're going to find in that desk, whatever you think Marcus arranged, I want you to be very clear that the Hartwell family's intention has always been that this wealth remains with the Hartwell bloodline. Eleanor looked up from the papers then. She looked at Patricia the way a surgeon looks at a procedure she has performed before, with complete familiarity, without a trace of fear. "Is that right?" Eleanor said. It was not a question. "That money is mine, sweetheart," Patricia said, and the smile widened slightly, pulling at the corners of her mouth with the particular tightness of a woman who has rehearsed this moment. It always was. The room was very quiet. Outside, 22 floors below, Park Avenue moved in its indifferent, continuous way. Taxis and black cars and the blur of a city that did not pause for anyone's grief or anyone's greed. Eleanor held Patricia's gaze for exactly 4 seconds. Then she looked back down at the desk and said quietly, "Thank you for coming by, Patricia. I'll have the housekeeper let you know when the estate attorney schedules the formal reading." Patricia lingered for a moment, clearly expecting something more. Tears, perhaps, or argument, or the kind of crumpling she had been waiting 14 years to witness. When she got none of those things, she set her handbag on her arm and walked to the door and paused with her hand on the frame. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," she said. Eleanor did not respond. She waited until she heard the elevator doors close. Then she opened the bottom left drawer of Marcus's desk. And there it was. Exactly where he had told her it would be, in the letter she had not yet read but would find that night, tucked inside the inside jacket pocket of the blazer he had left hanging on the back of his office door. A sealed brown legal envelope, thick with documents stamped in dark ink, ownership records. She did not open it. Not yet. She picked it up, held it in both hands for a moment, and felt, moving through her chest like the first warm current of spring through cold water, something she could only describe later as the sensation of being known, of being protected by a man who had loved her not with words but with precision and foresight and the full application of his extraordinary mind. She pressed the envelope briefly against her chest. Then she placed it carefully, reverently, into her tote bag, finished her review of the office and drove home. That night, after James was in bed, after she had read him 2 chapters of the book they had been working through together, a chapter book about a boy who builds a boat and sails around the world, Marcus's choice, something Marcus had read to James every Sunday night, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with a glass of Paoli fume and Marcus's letter and the sealed envelope. She found the letter exactly where he had described it in the letter itself, which was a very Marcus thing to do, to include in the letter the instructions for finding the letter, because he understood that grief disorients even the most capable people, and he wanted her to find it even if she was not at her best. The letter was 12 pages, handwritten in his clean, angular script on his personal stationery. She read every page twice, slowly, pausing sometimes to press her fingertips to the paper where the pen had pressed harder than usual and left a slight indentation, those places where the thought behind the sentence had been forceful enough to push through the surface. He had written everything. The complete structure of what he had built for her. The names of every professional involved. The location of every document. The explanation of why he had chosen each legal vehicle and each protection. And then in the final 2 pages, he had written to her not as a lawyer writing to a client but as a husband writing to a wife, and those 2 pages were the ones that cost Eleanor her composure, finally and completely, sitting alone at that kitchen table at 11:47 at night while the city moved outside the window and James slept upstairs and the wine sat untouched. She cried for a long time. Not hysterical crying. Not the kind of grief that demands an audience, but the deep bodily kind that moves through you like weather, that takes what it takes and leaves behind a particular quality of silence. When it was done, she wiped her face, drank the wine, and opened the envelope. She read every document inside it with the same systematic, analytical attention she had brought to every significant financial matter in her professional life, and by 1:30 in the morning she had a complete picture. She understood the architecture of what Marcus had built. She understood its elegance and its thoroughness. She understood what it meant. She also understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, exactly what Patricia was about to try to do. And she understood exactly how it was going to end. She called Sandra Voss the next morning at 8 o'clock. Sandra had been Marcus's estate attorney for 11 years. A tall, brisk woman in her mid-50s who wore her silver hair in a precise bob and who had never, in Eleanor's experience, used 3 words when 2 would do. Eleanor gave her a complete account of Patricia's visit to the office, the declaration about the money, and the envelope's contents. Sandra listened without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, Sandra said, "I've been waiting for her to move. She'll test the accounts first. Who manages your liquid holdings?" "David Chung," Eleanor said. "Call him before you hang up from me. Tell him to flag and log any contact from Patricia or anyone acting on her behalf, and to authorize nothing without written instruction from you." Eleanor called David Chung. David Chung, as it turned out, did not need the warning to be retroactive. He called back within the hour to tell her that the call had already come. The previous afternoon, the same afternoon Patricia had stood in Marcus's office and smiled at Eleanor, and said, "That money is mine, sweetheart." Patricia had contacted David's office and attempted to initiate a transfer authorization, citing a durable power of attorney over Marcus's estate. David had declined and flagged it. He had the timestamp. He had the recording. He sent Eleanor both. Eleanor forwarded them to Sandra with a 2-sentence note. "She moved faster than I expected. Let's bring in Andrew Roth." Andrew Roth was a name Marcus had mentioned once, 2 years before he died, in the context of a complicated estate dispute that a business associate of his had become entangled in. Marcus had said, with the precise admiration he reserved for professional excellence in others, "If I ever needed someone to make an opposing party understand the mathematics of their situation without theatrics, I would call Andrew Roth." Eleanor had remembered the name the way she remembered all the things Marcus said, with that particular quality of voice, completely and indefinitely. Sandra reached Roth by end of day. He reviewed the documentation over the following 48 hours and called Eleanor on Thursday morning. His voice was exactly what Marcus's description had suggested: quiet, measured, and possessed of the specific confidence that comes not from aggression but from thoroughness. He told her that the documents in the envelope, combined with the account access log and the power of attorney claim Patricia had made to David Chung, gave them not merely a defense but a position. He asked Eleanor how she wanted to handle it. Eleanor told him she wanted to wait. She wanted the formal estate reading. She wanted everyone present. She wanted it done once, completely, in a room where there could be no ambiguity afterward. "You want witnesses," Roth said. "I want witnesses," Eleanor confirmed. While Eleanor waited and prepared and said nothing publicly, Patricia accelerated. She had no reason not to. As far as she could tell, Eleanor was a grieving widow moving slowly through the administrative fog of loss, and the window for establishing a competing claim was narrowing. Patricia contacted 3 members of the Hartwell Capital Board of Directors within the first week after Marcus's funeral. She invited each of them separately to lunch at her Greenwich Club, a Georgian building off Round Hill Road that smelled of wood smoke and old money, and she spoke to each of them about the firm's future with the quiet authority of a woman who believes she is making inevitable arrangements. She described Eleanor as emotionally fragile. She suggested that a transitional advisory structure might be appropriate, one that would allow experienced hands. She did not say her hands, but the implication was architectural, to guide the firm through this sensitive period. She mentioned in each conversation that she had correspondence from Marcus indicating his wishes for the firm's long-term stewardship. She did not produce the correspondence. She simply referenced it, planting it in the air between herself and each board member like a seed she expected to harvest later. The 3 board members, Caldwell, Morrison, and Park, listened politely. They were men of the old Hartwell world. Men who had known Robert and who felt the gravitational pull of the Hartwell name. None of them committed to anything. But none of them called Eleanor either, which Patricia read as permission to continue. She continued. She made the call to the Delaware Holding Company's registered agent, attempting to obtain information about the company's membership structure. The registered agent, following the instructions that Eleanor's team had already placed on file, declined to discuss the matter and logged the inquiry. Patricia called the private banking division that managed the Bridgehampton property mortgage accounts. Same result. Same log. She contacted the brokerage managing Marcus's secondary investment account, identifying herself as a family member with the state authority and requesting account information. Declined. Logged. Every single attempt landing in Eleanor's growing file like another brick in a wall Patricia was building around herself without knowing it. Then Gregory Oakes made his mistake. Patricia had been cultivating Oakes for 3 years, attending his daughter's school play, mentioning his name at the right Greenwich dinner tables, sending a case of wine to his home each Christmas with a handwritten card. She had built, with patience and calculation, the kind of social debt that certain men in certain environments feel obligated to repay. She called him 2 weeks after Marcus's funeral and asked him, with all the warmth and directness of a family friend making a reasonable request, to share internal board meeting minutes from the past 18 months. She told him she needed to understand the firm's recent governance decisions in order to properly advise the transition process she was coordinating. Oakes thought about it for approximately 24 hours. He thought about Patricia's social network. He thought about the possibility that she represented the winning side of the upcoming estate dispute. He thought about the fact that Eleanor, who had always been pleasant but never particularly interested in cultivating him, would likely install her own people in key positions if she took over the firm. He made his calculation, and his calculation was wrong, and he sent Patricia 3 documents clearly marked as confidential firm materials from his firm email account, deleted the sent email, and believed himself to be done with it. What he did not know, because it was not information that circulated generally, was that Marcus had instituted 4 years earlier an automatic off-site archiving protocol for all outgoing communications from partner-level accounts. It was a security measure Marcus had implemented after a competitor firm suffered a damaging document leak. The archive ran silently, continuously, and without any individual's knowledge or ability to interrupt it. It caught Gregory Oakes's email to Patricia Hartwell within 6 seconds of its transmission, timestamped it, and filed it on a server in a data center in Northern Virginia. Sandra Voss had access to that archive. She pulled the Oakes email on a Thursday afternoon and sent it to Andrew Roth with a single line. The picture is complete. Roth called Eleanor that evening. He walked her through what they had, the restructuring documents, the deed transfers, the holding company registration, the account access log, the power of attorney attempt, and now the confidential document transmission between a Hartwell Capital partner and the person attempting to contest the estate. He told her that taken together, this was not a close call. It was a decisive one, and that if Patricia chose to proceed with formal legal action, the discovery process would expose everything she had done in the past 3 weeks in a forum where the consequences would be professional, financial, and potentially criminal. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want the reading in 2 weeks. Sandra's conference room. Invite the 3 board members Patricia lunched with. Invite Howard Schiff and the firm's general counsel. Invite Kate. And invite Patricia. She'll bring Foster Crane," Roth said. "I know," Eleanor said. "Good." In the 2 weeks between that phone call and the estate reading, Eleanor did not change anything visible about her life. She took James to school every morning. She attended the grief support group on Tuesday evenings, sitting in a circle of folding chairs in a community center in the East 80s, holding a paper cup of bad coffee, listening to other people describe the specific geography of loss and contributing her own observations with the careful honesty she brought to everything. She had dinner with Kate, who was quiet and sad and good in the particular way of people who understand that the most useful thing they can offer another person in grief is simply their presence. She went to the brownstone office she had set up in Marcus's study and worked through the estate documents in detail, organizing everything, understanding everything, until she could have described every asset, every transfer, every legal vehicle from memory without reference to a single page. She also had one conversation with Patricia by telephone, about 2 days before the reading. Patricia called under the pretense of checking in about James. She asked how James was doing, whether he was sleeping, whether Eleanor had thought about sending him to Dr. Harrison's recommended child therapist. She was warm and grandmotherly and her voice had no sharp edges, and Eleanor understood this too for exactly what it was, a reconnaissance call, an attempt to take Eleanor's emotional temperature, to assess whether the widow was softening, whether there was room to negotiate before the lawyers got in the room. Eleanor told her James was doing as well as could be expected. She told her the therapist idea was a good one and she was looking into it. She asked after Patricia's health. Patricia said she was managing. There was a pause and then Patricia said, "I hope we can approach the reading in a spirit of family, Eleanor. I hope we can remember that we're on the same side." "Absolutely," Eleanor said pleasantly. "See you Thursday." She hung up the phone, finished her tea, and went upstairs to check on James, who was asleep with a book on his chest and one arm hanging off the side of the bed, a position so specifically and characteristically James that Eleanor stood in the doorway looking at him for a full minute before she gently retrieved the book, tucked his arm back under the blanket, and kissed his forehead. Thursday came the way Thursdays always come, unremarkably, in the ordinary gray light of a New York morning. Taxis on the street and coffee carts on the corners and the city doing its perpetual, indifferent, magnificent business. Eleanor dressed with care but without theater. The black Celine blazer, the white silk blouse, the dark trousers, the low-heeled shoes. She pulled her hair back cleanly. She wore Marcus's watch, a Patek Philippe in rose gold that he had given her on their 10th anniversary, which she had barely taken off since his death. She picked up the black leather portfolio case from the hall table, checked that the envelope and the organized document package were inside it, and drove to Sandra's offices in a black town car. Sandra Voss's conference room occupied the corner of the 44th floor of a building on 52nd Street, with 2 walls of glass overlooking the mid-Manhattan skyline. It was a large room, furnished in the serious, neutral way of rooms designed to hold serious conversations. A long walnut table, leather chairs, water pitchers and glasses already set out, a credenza with the firm's discreet logo in brushed steel on the wall above it. Eleanor arrived 12 minutes before the scheduled time. Andrew Roth was already there, seated to Sandra's right, a neat stack of documents in front of him, his reading glasses on the table beside them. He stood when Eleanor entered, shook her hand and said nothing else. They were people who understood each other. The others arrived over the next 10 minutes. Howard Schiff, the CFO, arrived with the firm's general counsel, a precise and watchful man named Daniel Lau. The 3 board members, Caldwell, Morrison and Park, arrived together, which Eleanor noted and filed. Kate arrived looking pale and composed, wearing a dark wool dress and the small pearl studs she always wore, and she crossed the room and squeezed Eleanor's hand before sitting down. Patricia arrived last. She arrived with Foster Crane, her attorney, who was everything his reputation suggested, silver-haired, expensively suited, possessed of the unhurried confidence of a man who makes his living being the most prepared person in difficult rooms. Patricia herself was in the cream Chanel suit, the pearl earrings, her white hair in its immaculate set. She surveyed the room as she entered, and Eleanor watched her do it, watched the quick, practiced inventory of who was present and where they sat, the brief recalibration that happened in Patricia's eyes when she processed the full attendance of the room, the board members, Schiff, Roth, the weight of it. Then Patricia looked at Eleanor and Eleanor looked back and Patricia smiled the smile. The particular, contained, calibrated smile of a woman who has decided how this ends. Eleanor did not return the smile. She simply looked at Patricia with the steady, level attention of someone who has nothing to perform, and then she turned and set her portfolio case on the table in front of her chair and sat down, and set the sealed brown envelope on the table directly in front of her, and folded her hands and waited. Patricia looked at the envelope. Something moved behind her eyes. A flicker of something that was not quite concern but was adjacent to it. A small quick shadow that passed and was replaced by composure. She sat down across from Eleanor. Foster Crane arranged his documents beside her. Sandra Voss opened the meeting. She moved through the formal procedural elements with brisk efficiency, identifying everyone present, stating the purpose and date, confirming that the relevant parties had received the preliminary notice. She was halfway through her opening summary when Foster Crane spoke. He did not wait for his turn. He set a document on the table and slid it toward Sandra with the polished precision of a man making an opening move he has made many times before. He stated that he was presenting, on behalf of Patricia Hartwell, a formal claim of co-ownership interest in the assets of Hartwell Capital Partners and the associated Hartwell Family Estate Holdings, founded on 2 bases. First, a provision in the original Articles of Incorporation of Hartwell Capital referencing the founding role of the Hartwell Family Trust, in which Patricia held residual interest. And second, a body of correspondence between Marcus Hartwell and his mother in which Marcus had, according to Crane, clearly expressed his intention to ensure Patricia's financial security from the firm's proceeds in perpetuity. He placed the correspondence on the table. He placed a legal summary. He placed a cover letter. He did it with the measured efficiency of a man who believes he has arrived with the superior hand. Sandra Voss looked at the documents without touching them. She looked at Andrew Roth. Andrew Roth looked at Eleanor. Eleanor picked up the sealed brown envelope. The sound of the seal breaking was small in the room. It was the sound of paper giving way to intention, of the careful meeting the prepared, of a man's last gift to his wife arriving precisely at the moment it was meant to. Eleanor removed the documents. She had organized them herself into tab sections. She set the package on the table, opened to the first tab and began. "This," she said, and her voice was completely level, not loud, not theatrical, simply clear and exact the way Marcus's voice had been clear and exact when he was most certain of what he was saying, "is the Certificate of Trust Restructuring for Hartwell Capital Partners, dated 3 years ago, notarized and filed with the Delaware Secretary of State. It names me, Eleanor Catherine Hartwell, as the sole primary beneficiary and successor trustee of Marcus Robert Hartwell's 68% controlling interest in the firm." She slid a copy across the table. "To Sandra. To Andrew Roth. To Howard Schiff. To each of the board members." One copy landing in front of Foster Crane. "This," she continued, turning to the second tab, "is the executed deed transfer for the property at 74 East 78th Street in Manhattan, the property at 12 Dune Road in Bridgehampton, and the property at 400 Summit View Drive in Aspen, Colorado. All 3 properties are conveyed into my name individually and solely. All 3 transfers are notarized, recorded with the relevant county recorder's offices, and have been in effect for 3 years." Another round of copies. The room very quiet. She moved through each tab with the unhurried completeness of a woman who has prepared not for an argument but for a documentation, because those are different things, and she had always understood the difference. The Delaware Holding Company. The asset transfer certificates. The signed beneficiary designations for every financial account in the estate. Each document landing on the table with a soft final sound. Then she reached the last tab. She removed a document that was different from the others, not a legal certificate, not a transfer record, but 12 pages of handwriting on cream personal stationery, a notarized copy with the original held privately at Sandra's office in a fireproof vault. She placed it on the table and said quietly, "This is a letter written by Marcus Hartwell in his own hand, notarized by his personal notary, explaining in detail the complete restructuring of the family's assets and the reasons for every decision he made. I will not read it aloud, but it is part of the record." She closed the portfolio and folded her hands on the table and looked at Foster Crane. Foster Crane was looking at the documents in front of him. He was reading the trust certificate with the focused, rapid attention of a man recalculating. Beside him, Patricia was very still. The cream Chanel suit, the pearl earrings, the immaculate white hair. All the architecture of her presentation was intact, but something underneath it had shifted. The way a building's facade stays standing for a moment after the structural supports have given way. Andrew Roth cleared his throat. It was a small sound, but it had the quality of a door opening. "In addition to the estate documentation," he said, placing his own stack of papers on the table with the quiet efficiency of a man adding the final items to a completed structure, "I am presenting a log of attempted unauthorized account access conducted over the 14 days following Marcus Hartwell's death, originating from telephone numbers registered to Patricia Hartwell, including an attempt to initiate a transfer authorization on accounts belonging to Eleanor Hartwell using a claimed power of attorney that does not exist in any filed document." The log went on the table. "I am also presenting archived communications retrieved from Hartwell Capital's Automatic Security Archive, showing the transmission of 3 documents marked as confidential firm materials from Gregory Oakes, a Hartwell Capital partner, to Patricia Hartwell, via firm email, on a date 14 days after Marcus Hartwell's death." The archive records went on the table. These documents were transmitted without authorization and constitute a breach of fiduciary duty on the part of Mr. Oakes and potential tortious interference with the estate on the part of Ms. Hartwell. He set his pen down. "I want to be transparent," he said, still in that same quiet, even tone, the tone of a man who does not need volume because he has substance, that should Ms. Hartwell choose to proceed with the claim presented today, the discovery process and any resulting litigation would require full disclosure of both the account access attempts and the document transmission in a court record. We are entirely prepared for that process." The room held its silence for a moment. Howard Schiff was reading the trust certificate. He had put on his reading glasses and he was reading with the focused intensity of a man confirming something he had hoped to find. Daniel Lau, the general counsel, was reading the deed transfers. The 3 board members, Caldwell, Morrison, and Park, were very carefully looking at the documents in front of them and not at Patricia, which was its own kind of statement. Foster Crane leaned toward his client. His voice was low, but in the quality of silence that had settled over the room, it carried further than intended. "Patricia," he said, and the single word had the weight of a professional conclusion. Patricia did not move for a moment. She sat in that precise, practiced stillness of a woman who has built her entire life around the performance of composure, and the performance was holding barely, at the outer edge of its capacity. Then she looked at Eleanor. Directly, without the smile this time, without the calibrated warmth or the sharp edges or any of the tools she had spent 14 years deploying. Just Patricia Hartwell looking at Eleanor Hartwell across a walnut table in a conference room 44 floors above 52nd Street, at the end of everything she had planned. Eleanor looked back. She did not look triumphant. She did not look cruel. She looked simply like a woman who knows exactly where she stands and has no need to prove it to anyone. "This is not the end of this," Patricia said, and her voice had changed. The polish was still there, but the certainty beneath it was gone, and without the certainty it sounded like something else entirely, like the beginning of a sentence that had no ending. "It is," Eleanor said. The same two words she had said in Marcus's office, said the same way. Simply, finally, like setting something down that you have been carrying for a very long time. Patricia stood. Foster Crane rose with her. She picked up her handbag, the Hermes Kelly in bone white that she had carried to every significant moment of her adult life, and she walked to the door of the conference room, and she did not look back. The door closed behind her with a soft, decisive sound. No one spoke for a moment. Then Howard Schiff removed his reading glasses, folded them, and placed them in his breast pocket and looked at Eleanor and said, "The board will honor the restructuring documentation in full. I want you to hear that directly from me, and I want the record to show it." "Thank you, Howard," Eleanor said. Kate reached across the corner of the table and put her hand over Eleanor's. She still said nothing. Eleanor looked at her and felt, moving through the complicated grief of that moment, the grief for Marcus, the grief for the family that might have been, the particular sadness of watching someone destroy themselves, the simple, clean warmth of genuine loyalty, and she held Kate's hand for a moment before she turned back to the table. Sandra Voss proceeded with the reading. It took another 40 minutes. Every document was reviewed, every provision confirmed, every question from Schiff and Lau answered with the precision that Sandra brought to everything. By the time it was finished, Eleanor Hartwell was the documented, legally unassailable owner of a $340 million estate, a controlling interest in one of New York's most respected private equity firms, and 3 properties in 2 states, plus a Manhattan office building. She drove home in the town car in the early afternoon light, watching the city move outside the window the way Marcus had always watched it, with the attention of someone who finds it genuinely interesting, never exhausted by it, and she thought about the envelope now back in her portfolio, and about the 12 pages of handwriting, and about the pressed 4-leaf clover she would find at the very back of the document packet when she reviewed it one final time that evening, tucked inside a plain white note card with no writing on it. She had not reached that tab yet. She would find it that night after James was in bed, at the kitchen table with the last of the Powley fume, and she would hold it in her palm for a long time, that small preserved thing still faintly green, and she would understand exactly what he meant by it, and it would break her open one more time gently, in the way of things that are finished and complete and exactly right. Foster Crane withdrew the legal claim 11 days after the conference room meeting. His letter to Sandra was 2 paragraphs and cited further review of the estate documentation. Sandra forwarded it to Eleanor with a single line. Done. Gregory Oakes was terminated from Hartwell Capital within 3 weeks. The termination was handled internally, without press, framed as a mutual separation. His severance was precisely what his contract required and nothing beyond that. In the months that followed, he found that the private equity community in New York had acquired a specific and comprehensive knowledge of why he had left, and that this knowledge made lateral movement within the industry essentially impossible. He took a position eventually at a mid-market real estate fund in suburban New Jersey, managing assets that were a fraction of what he had overseen at Hartwell Capital, in an office that was a fraction of the size, in a building that was a fraction of the address, and he told himself it was temporary, and the years passed. Patricia Hartwell's world contracted. It contracted in the way that worlds in her particular social register always contract when the thing at the center of them has been removed. Not loudly, not with announced exclusions, but through the slow withdrawal of invitations, the phone calls that became less frequent, the lunch arrangements that were indefinitely delayed. The 3 board members she had cultivated did not speak publicly about what they had witnessed in Sandra Voss's conference room, because men like Caldwell, Morrison, and Park did not speak publicly about anything. But they also did not call Patricia, and they did not accept her invitations to the Greenwich Club, and they did not mention her name when speaking about Hartwell Capital's transition. She had been weighed in the room where it mattered and found wanting, and in that world, once that judgment was reached, it was not reversed. The Greenwich estate, the 14-room colonial that had been the physical expression of Patricia's identity for 30 years, went on the market 14 months after the conference room. The balloon payment on the refinanced mortgage had come due, and Patricia's defined inheritance, without supplementation from Marcus's estate, could not carry it. The estate sold in a private transaction for $11.2 million, which was considered a reasonable price for a house in Greenwich's mid-tier market and which, after the mortgage payoff, left Patricia with enough to purchase a 2-bedroom condominium in a well-maintained building in Stamford and to maintain, at some ongoing sacrifice, her club membership and a limited version of her previous social schedule. She moved into the Stamford condominium on a Wednesday in January, 18 months after Marcus's death. She unpacked the Chanel suits and hung them in the narrower closet of her new bedroom. She hung one oil painting in the living room, a Connecticut landscape that Robert had purchased at an auction in 1987, the one piece from the Greenwich estate that she had kept because it was the one that had always been specifically hers. She arranged her things in the smaller space with the careful, private dignity of a woman who has decided that she will not be seen to diminish, even in a room where no one can see her. And then she sat in the chair by the window that looked out at the Stamford parking structure and she was, for the first time in a very long time, simply alone with the consequences of her choices, in a room that was exactly the size of what she had actually earned. Eleanor did not know about the condominium for several weeks. When Kate told her, over dinner at a restaurant in the West Village on a rainy Tuesday evening, Eleanor listened and then was quiet for a moment and then said simply, "I hope she's okay." She meant it. That was the thing about Eleanor, the thing that Patricia had never understood and could never have understood, because understanding it would have required Patricia to be a different kind of person, that Eleanor's capacity for mercy was not weakness and was not performance. It was the natural condition of a woman who did not need her enemies to suffer in order to feel safe. She had what she needed. James was healthy. Marcus's work was secure. The foundation her husband had built for her was standing and she was standing on it, and from that ground she could afford to wish, genuinely and without irony, that the woman who had tried to take it from her had found a way to be at peace. She took over the chairmanship of Hartwell Capital's board at the 12-month mark, in consultation with Howard Schiff and the board, in a non-executive capacity focused on long-term strategy. She brought to it the Columbia finance training and the 14 years of watching Marcus work, and the very specific intelligence of a woman who had survived grief and betrayal inside the same season and emerged from both knowing exactly who she was. The firm's first year under her oversight was the strongest in 3 years. Howard Schiff sent her a brief email at year-end that said only, "Marcus knew what he was doing." She saved the email. She established the Marcus Robert Hartwell Scholarship Fund at Columbia University, endowed at $3 million, designated for first-generation students in finance and economics. It was not announced at a gala or covered in the press. The university put out a brief statement and Eleanor gave a single short interview to the Columbia Alumni magazine, in which she said that Marcus believed the most important investments were the ones that compounded across generations, and that she intended to honor that belief for as long as she was able. James turned 9 in the spring. Eleanor took him and 6 of his friends to a Yankees game in a box suite, and he ate 3 hot dogs and wore Marcus's old Yankees cap that was 3 sizes too large and kept falling over his eyes, and Eleanor sat beside him in the 7th-inning stretch and watched him sing, "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," with the off-key enthusiasm of a boy who is exactly and completely in the moment he is in, and she felt the presence of Marcus so acutely and so specifically, in the shape of James's jaw, in the way he tilted his head when something made him laugh, that she had to look away for a moment at the field, at the green of the outfield grass under the stadium lights, at the simple and perpetual beauty of a game that does not stop for anything. She looked back at her son. He was grinning at her under the brim of the too large cap, hot dog in hand, completely happy in the way of children who are safe and loved and have not yet learned to be afraid of the future. "You good, Mom?" he said. "Yeah, baby," she said. "I'm good." On the desk in her Park Avenue office, beside the framed photograph of Marcus and James at the beach, James on Marcus's shoulders, both of them laughing, the late August light coming off the water at the angle it only achieves in those last golden weeks of summer, there is a small object in a plain glass frame. A pressed four-leaf clover still faintly green mounted on cream paper. No title. No explanation. No inscription. She does not need one. She knows what it means. She knows what he meant by leaving it there, tucked at the back of the envelope that contained everything he had built to protect her. This small found, improbable thing that he had kept because you keep it when you find it, because finding it means something, because some things in this life arrive precisely when they are supposed to and mean precisely what they mean and do not require any further words. On the days when the work is hard or the grief comes back in that sudden, clarifying way it does, not in waves anymore, but in specific moments of recognition, the way you smell cedar and black pepper in a room he has not been in for 2 years, she looks at the clover and she straightens in her chair and she turns back to her work. Lucky. She knows. She always knew.